Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the first part of the writing section of the Hebrew Bible. So we're going to deal with today Psalms through Song of Solomon. Um, as I've said before, I'm going to try and in these last few lectures in the latter half of the class, I'm going to try to shorten the lectures a bit. So most of the lecture will be basically me summarizing some of these slides. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them. Most of the material that is in the slides is in your reading. It's just me articulating it a bit differently so that I can try to give you a summary or an overview of these books and how they fit together. So this lecture may be a bit short, but I don't want you to think that it's unimportant or that you won't be tested on it. I'll make sure that I arrange the quiz questions to be about what we've covered. All right, so with that being said, uh, we're going to talk first of all about the writing section of the Hebrew Bible, and then we'll jump into the books. So first of all, the seams of the Old Testament play in here because, as you may have read in House or in the optional Sailhammer article, uh, there are seams that are intended to tie together the four sections or the three sections of the Hebrew Bible. Um, the authors of these works put these seams in to tie them together. So the end of the Pentateuch, the first section of the Hebrew Bible, and the beginning of Joshua, the beginning of the next section of the Hebrew Bible, the prophets, is a seam, and then the end of Malachi is also related to both of those passages. So that's the end of the prophets, and then the beginning of Psalms. Psalm 1 is related to all three of those. Um, and here in these slides, what I've done is detailed to you the parallels between each of these passages. I'm not going to go into detail here. I just give you these so that you can see what's similar in terms of textual connections, and then what that's supposed to show you is that the three parts of the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, and the writings, are integrally connected. In other words, um, somebody has tied these together textually. An author has tied these together textually, um, and they're connected in the fact that they're looking for a prophet. So end of Deuteronomy, beginning of Joshua looks for a prophet like Moses. They're looking for a priest and they're looking for a king. Both of those ideas are found in Psalm 1 as well as the kingship idea in Deuteronomy 34 and Joshua 1 as well. They're looking for a prophet, priest, king who will rule, save, achieve victory for God's people. Okay, so we've talked about a lot in this class. The Old Testament is eschatological, it's looking forward. And it's looking for Christ because Christ is the prophet, priest, king who will rule, save, and achieve victory for God's people. So as we've talked about in each of the other two sections of the Hebrew Bible, when we read, we need to read eschatologically and Christologically. For the writings, there's some variations in their shape. Sometimes Ruth appears first, and sometimes Chronicles comes in its chronological order before Ezra and Nehemiah. It's also possible at some points that we see Chronicles at the beginning of the writings, and then Proverbs and Jobs switch places. Um, the first three of these can be explained by a tendency to approach the Old Testament literature chronologically. So Ruth seems to be Ruth is prior to David, at least the story is, and so the book of Ruth, which tells of the birth of David, should come before the Psalms of David. Sort of the rationale there. Chronicles is chronologically prior to Ezra and Nehemiah. Um, Chronicles at the beginning uh, is chronological because Chronicles starts with Genesis 1, starts with Adam. So all of those can be explained chronologically. However, the order that we're going to talk about is supported by the New Testament, specifically by Luke 24 and Matthew 23, also Luke 16, Luke 11. Here, Jesus refers to the order that we're going to look at, and the Matthew 23 passage specifically refers to Chronicles being at the end. So there Jesus says all the prophets from Abel to Zechariah, and the Zechariah that he's referencing is the Zechariah in Chronicles. And so he seems to be saying, he's making a statement about the whole Bible, and he uses Genesis and Chronicles as beginning and end. So, sorry, you're going to have to forgive me, I've got allergies pretty bad today. So, in any case, the order that we're going to look at is well attested, and it seems to be attested to by Jesus. So, we're going to use that order. It's the order that the Jewish people put their Bible in today, so we're going to use that order to walk through. So, just to give you an overview, okay, and this is where I want you to focus your attention, just to give you an overview of the story of these books. We start with Psalms and Job, and in Psalms, we're searching for, right, Psalms 1 through 3 really give us a good picture of what we're looking for. We're looking for the wise man who rules as the king and who is also a suffering servant in Psalm 3. And so in Psalms and in Job, we're looking for that wise king, the righteous man who is also a suffering servant. And then Job also contains this idea of a foolish woman in Job's wife. In Proverbs, we start off with the foolish woman versus Lady Wisdom. We're searching for a wise man still. So chapters 10 through 30 focus on the wise man, and then chapter 31 shifts us back to focusing on the wise woman, the virtuous woman. Ruth shifts away from the virtuous, righteous, suffering servant man, wise king motif, and shifts back towards the woman. This time a Gentile woman, and Boaz is a righteous man. So we're looking for a wise king who's also a suffering servant. We see the suffering servant aspect in Job. Then in Proverbs, we're still looking for this wise man, wise king, who pursues Lady Wisdom instead of Lady Folly. In Ruth, we get a real-life picture of that with Ruth and Boaz. And then with songs, we have songs giving us a portrait of a king and his bride who are united in the garden. And so really songs is sort of this poetic culmination of the hope of these first 5 books. And as I say, there's a reason songs is at the center, is because it really portrays the hope of Israel. They're looking for the wise king who suffers for his people, pursuing the virtuous woman, his bride, in a renewed earth. And that's the portrait that songs gives us. But then Ecclesiastes and Lamentations give us a reality check. Life is vanity, it's not what it should be in Ecclesiastes, and in Lamentations, historically, it's not what it should be. The temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed. So God hasn't come to redeem his people yet. We're still looking for, in other words, the king and his bride in a renewed earth. In Esther, Daniel, we get prophetic types of both the man and the woman. So, sort of like the former prophets look forward by reminding us of what's already happened. Same thing with Esther, Daniel. They're pointing us forward to the woman and the man who will renew God's people. And then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles remind us that even though Israel has been brought back by King Cyrus, we're still waiting for the real return from exile. And so really the shape of the writings is we're looking for this person, but it's not yet. So we're still looking. Is kind of the idea here. As we move through these books, the themes that I've pointed out already, We're looking for a righteous, wise, ruling prophet, priest, king, who is also a suffering servant. We're looking for the virtuous, wise woman, the bride of the king. We're looking for the return from exile. We're looking for this king to redeem his bride and return from exile. In other words, the message is that the return under King Cyrus in Ezra and Nehemiah is not the new Exodus that the former prophets are looking for, or the latter prophets. And it's also talking about how the people of God can live virtuously and in wisdom. So they're eschatological and Christological, but they're also ethical, and they're creationally oriented. How do you live in God's place? All of this is pointing us forward to God renewing his people through his wise king who suffers and redeems his bride. When that happens, the people will live in the land with him in this way. Okay, so lots of stuff going on in the writing section, but it's all eschatological. It's all looking forward to Christ. So when we get to the Psalms, I'm not going to go over authorship too much. I just want to say that there are at least there's at least five identified authors, plus 50 of the Psalms are technically anonymous. So a third of the Psalms don't have an author's name attached to them. Another 100 do, mostly David. And then people tied to David, so Asaph is tied to David because he helps David in the court. And then the others are attached to the sons of Korah and to Moses, and then finally to Solomon. So this wasn't something where somebody sat down and wrote 150 Psalms. David didn't write them all. Somebody arranged them, okay, right here after the exile. And we know this because, for instance, Psalm 80, I think it's Psalm 72, other Psalms speak about the exile. So somebody took all these Psalms and arranged them in a particular order after the exile. The word Psalms in Greek is Psalmos, that's where we get the name. In Hebrew, the name is Tehillim, which means praises. And they function in a musical context, okay, so they're used for worship. They address all aspects of life. Many of David's Psalms are about specific instances in his life. Okay, so, the church throughout its history has sung Psalms in worship because they're meant to be sung in worship. But we need to think broader than just individual Psalms and how they might be sung to the canonical context. What happens is, even though David writes some of these Psalms in instances in his life, even though Moses writes one Psalm a long time ago, even though Solomon writes some, and Asaph and the sons of Korah, etc., those historical contexts have been minimized by putting all of these Psalms into one book. So that the point now is to read the Psalms as one book and not just as individual Psalms. When we look at the shape of the Psalter, there's 5 books. Each of these has a psalm at the end of doxological praise, so it ends with praising God. And then it also appears possibly to tell a narrative of exile and restoration. It may reflect the 5 books of Moses, but in any case, what the author has done when he's compiled these psalms into one book is arranged them in a certain way. And so many times when we preach or teach Psalms, we try to really identify the historical context and really focus on that. But the focus is really, because these have been put together and arranged like this, the focus ought to be on the canonical shape of the book, or the order of the Psalms, etc. When we look at that shape, the thing that we see is that the psalmist is searching for the wise man, Psalm 1, the Messiah, the ruling king, Psalm 2, and the suffering servant, Psalm 3. The king of Israel who's going to come and save his people. We're looking for a return from exile, Psalm 78, verse 36. This is the very middle of the Psalter, and it's looking for the return from exile for Israel. Many psalms retell Israel's story, so they're retelling Israel's story in order to look forward to Israel's future. Okay, so in other words, the shape is, this is what God did in the past. We're here in exile right now, and we lament that, but we hope for the future where God will send this kind of man, the Messiah, Christ. In Job, we focus almost exclusively on the suffering servant part of that we were looking for in the Psalms. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here on the outline. I just want to say that the issue is Job's righteousness in the midst of suffering. Okay, and obviously there's theodicy here, right? They're trying to explain the problem of evil. The author of Job is. But at the core of the book is a righteous man who suffers righteously. And again, points us forward. And at the end of Job, I'm going to see the Lord even after death. I'm going to be raised from the dead. Job hopes in God. We're looking at, why do we suffer? Why does God bless or why does it seem like God blesses the righteous and God curses the wicked? That's not what the rest of the Bible says, but this is Job's question. And Job wants to hear from God on this question, but God doesn't answer directly. He just shows up and says, "Hey, I'm God." Job is, in most of the book, dialoguing with three of his friends. And so the question is, who is wise? Is it Job who's wise? Is it the friends who's wise? Or is it God who's wise? And really, at the end, it's God. We're still looking for a perfectly wise man. Psalm 1 starts off with, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly." This is Job 10. This is Job 21. Again, we're looking for a righteous man who suffers and who intercedes for his people. Of course, he's not Christ. He doesn't suffer perfectly. He complains. He needs repentance, but he is saved through repentance in chapter 42. So Job deals with theodicy. It deals with why we suffer. It deals with who is wise, and therefore it points us forward to looking for the wise man who suffers well. And then in Proverbs, this search that Psalms and Job have put us in really culminates in Proverbs. Now, I'm not going to say that it's climaxing here, but it does sort of find its definitive description in Proverbs, because we're looking in Proverbs for the wise king, the son of Solomon. And in the midst of that, we get sort of this additional search for Lady Wisdom, the right bride for the king. In Proverbs, the Proverbs themselves are primarily distiches. This means that they have two parts, basically, two lines. And the Proverbs tend to be, and even the lines tend to be antithetical, so contrasts. Deals with all kinds of things: poverty and wealth, slander, self-discipline, speech, etc. That's true. These things are true of the rest of the sections of the book. So the sayings of the wise men, which is based on this Mesopotamian work, the instructions of a Menemope. Then you get more Proverbs of Solomon, still distiches. They're arranged more topically, so you can kind of discern what the topics are. Then you get sayings of Agur, sayings of Lemuel, and then you end with the virtuous woman. And what's going on here is that Proverbs has spent chapters 10 through half of chapter 31 describing what a wise man looks like. And now we're going back, because at the beginning of the book, the key to the wise man is that he pursues the wise woman. So that's why the book starts that way, because if you pursue Lady Lady Folly, you're automatically not wise. And so the real marker of a wise man is his pursuit of a wise woman. And so we get a tangible picture of that wise woman in Proverbs 31:10 through 31. And as I probably have mentioned, the way that Proverbs 31 describes this virtuous woman is saying a virtuous woman who can find, and then it describes her, and then at the end it says she'll be praised in the gates. And this is exactly what Ruth 3:11 says about Ruth. It says she was found to be a virtuous woman who is praised in the gates. And so when we get to Ruth in just a minute, we'll see that Ruth is this picture of the virtuous woman. Some themes of Proverbs that you probably need to remember: fear of the Lord. So what is the fear of the Lord? Well, fear doesn't mean you're a scaredy cat, although there's some implications there about being afraid. But it means a proper understanding of who God is and who we are in light of who God is. So proper understanding of God's holiness and our sinfulness, and realizing that we can't stand before him without his help. I've mentioned Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly a number of times. Again, we're getting these idealized descriptions looking for Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. Then training. The book is primarily a book that's set in the context of a king trying to train his son to be wise. And this reminds us of the whole history of Israel. God is trying to train Israel to be a wise son, and he's not. You also have creation language. So Proverbs 8 talks about creation specifically. Wisdom is patterned after the created order. So being wise means paying attention to the created order, means being in the same rhythm as God's rhythm that he's put into creation. But it also talks a lot about Adam and Eve and the fall. So you got this language of blessing and cursing. You have this language of righteous and evil. You've got garden and tree language, lots of that, and especially in chapters 1 through 9, where you get all these sort of allusions back to Genesis 1 through 3. And so wisdom is set in the context of what Adam and Eve were supposed to have and didn't. And then you have eschatological language. In Proverbs 1, you get God saying, I'm going to pour out my spirit. You get language about the exile, and so you're looking forward to God pouring out his spirit and bringing Israel out of exile. So all of these books are really looking forward to what's to come. Now, before we jump into Ruth, let's pause for a minute. I want you to gather your thoughts and just try to envision how we've talked about each of these books being connected. Many times we read the wisdom literature in our English Bibles as totally disparate books, but I want you to think about, and I want you to think of specific instances where you can connect the search for the wise man in Psalms, in Job, and in Proverbs. And then when you're done, we'll pick back up with Ruth. So in Ruth, what happens is we shift towards looking for the virtuous woman. Although we've seen that pop up in especially Proverbs, but also Job, because Job's wife is foolish and not wise. So she's compared to Lady Folly. In Ruth, we shift our focus exclusively almost to looking for the virtuous woman. We don't know who the author of Ruth is, somebody after David. The fact that they don't mention Solomon seems to make it sound like it might be in the time of David, though it's not clear. I think we've talked about the placement of this book, so I'm not going to deal with that really very much. But it's between Proverbs and Songs here. In your English Bibles, of course, it's between Judges and 1 Samuel. This makes a difference in the emphases that we see in the book. It doesn't mean that those emphases are not there, depending on the order. It just means that the order highlights certain things in one place, and it highlights other things in another place. It's set in the period of the Judges. Persecution has led to famine, and Elimelech and Naomi and their two sons moved to Moab, which was an enemy of Israel, for food, and they lived there for 10 years. Their two sons marry Ruth and Orpah, and then all the men die. So Naomi, the mother-in-law, and then Ruth and Orpah, two Gentile women, say we're going to go back to Israel. Elimelech means my God is king. This points us forward to chapter 4, verse 22, where David, the future king, is told to be a descendant of Ruth. Ironically, Elimelech leaves the land where he knows that God is king and goes to the Gentile land. The family is lacking food, specifically bread. Bethlehem equals house of bread, but they don't have any bread. They don't have any husbands, and they don't have any progeny, and they don't have a king. Right? In Judges, there was no king in Israel is the refrain over and over again. All of this is solved in chapters 2 through 4, specifically by a kinsman redeemer. The marriage of somebody who is a kinsman gives Ruth progeny, which is most important, namely, so children, kingship, because it leads to the line of David, and land, which leads also to her ability to get food. So the book moves from death to life. It's really a beautifully written story. They return to Bethlehem in chapter 1, verse 6. And the pattern here is exile and return. They go out of the land and they return. The word here is shuv, which is the word that is used both for repentance in the Old Testament and for the return from exile. Okay? And it occurs all those times in chapter 1, so that's a big, big theme for Ruth, is returning specifically from exile in the land of Moab instead of in the land of Israel. And then in chapter 4:15, Ruth is Mashuv Nefesh. She is a returner of life. But she's a Gentile. I mean, this is the fascinating thing about this book, is that this whole thing, exile and return, is predicated on a Gentile. So Ruth is faithful. She exhibits faithfulness here, even though she doesn't have to be. She confesses, your God will be my God, in contrast to Orpah, who decides to go back to her own land and to her own gods, is the implication. It really is a beautiful book. In the fields, Boaz is compared to David. He is an Eshet Hayil, a strong man. This is a term that's used for David as well. And his name is also the name of one of the temple columns, interestingly enough. Ruth's journey is compared to Abraham's. If you go look at Genesis 12:1 and Ruth 2:11, those are very similar in wording, and also to Rebecca's. In other words, Ruth is a matriarch of Israel. This is such a fascinating book. Ruth is a matriarch of Israel in the sense that it is through her that Israel is saved. Israel's born through her, really. I mean, if we think about, they're in exile and they come back and they're restored to the land, and it's David the king from her line. She uses the law for the poor that's articulated in Leviticus 19 to go and pick leftover grain, and meets Boaz. And Boaz is one of Naomi's kinsman redeemers. So in other words, he's related to Boaz. She's related to Boaz, and therefore Boaz can marry Ruth as a kinsman redeemer. Very fascinating in terms of how Ruth the Gentile restores Israel. So on the threshing floor, they have a chance meeting, followed in chapter 2, followed by a deliberate encounter. Ruth is going after her man. The verb to lie down does imply something happened more than just conversation, or it can. I don't say it does, but it can imply. And Ruth denies anything that happened, and 3:11 describes her as a virtuous woman. So it doesn't seem contextually that anything sexual happens here, but Ruth is proposing to Boaz, and so in chapter 4. Ruth is praised as a virtuous woman in the gates, and Boaz and Ruth live happily ever after. The conclusion of this book is King David comes from Ruth's line. And again, the point here is Ruth is described as a virtuous woman in the language of Proverbs 31, we've been looking for this wise woman in contrast to Job's wife and because of Proverbs 1 through 9. And now we've seen an example of her that leads to David. Okay, so the real, I don't know why this should say Song of Solomon right here, but I don't know why it's deleted. But the real culmination of all this is Song of Solomon. Many people say, and this is sort of the quote here that I'm not going to read in full, but that it's just a picture of monogamous sexual love. The rather crude way that I like to put this is that people think Song of Solomon is just a Christian Karma Sutra. It's just a sex manual. This is not true. Okay. For most of the church's history, there's a hidden meaning in songs that it refers to Christ. And they use the term allegory. And we don't have time to talk about the differences between good and bad allegory, but suffice it to say that there is something called atextual allegory that's trying to find a meaning without any textual evidence whatsoever. And most of modern interpretation accuses pre-modern interpretation of being atextual in their allegorical reading of songs. So they don't think it can be about Christ and the church because they don't see the textual evidence for it. Okay, we're running out of time here. So I'm going to just briefly go through these, but I want you to hear this. The textual evidence is actually very clear that songs is about more than a sex manual. It clearly alludes to the Garden of Eden. It clearly alludes to the temple. It clearly alludes to the Davidic covenant. It clearly alludes to Lady Wisdom. And it has very clear eschatological language. Okay? If you've listened to these lectures and if you've read House, the things that we are looking for are the last days, eschatology. Here you've been hearing me talk about the fact that we're looking for Lady Wisdom, we're looking for a new temple, we're looking for a new David, and we're looking for a restored Garden of Eden. Something is going on here more than just the story of two people that love each other. Okay, so I list out these things. I wish we had time to walk through them carefully, but you see the references to David, you see the references to Solomon. Solomon is the seed, right? He's the line through whom the Messiah is going to come. In 1 Kings, he's presented as a new Adam. So this is very charged language. Same thing with Lady Wisdom language. The Shulamite woman in songs is presented as a wise woman. And in contrast to Lady Folly, her body is compared to a fruitful garden. She's spoken of as being wise. All this kind of thing is just very charged language about who we're looking for in a woman. She's Lady Wisdom. Likewise, temple language. 1 Kings 7, the description of the temple is the same description as the people's bodies in Song of Solomon. Their bodies are presented as the temple. You can look up all these references if you want to. I encourage you to. Again, eschatological language, pointing us forward. We're looking forward to the same thing that Numbers 24 looks forward to. So the same language in Numbers 24 that looks for a new garden, new Israel, new creation, all that language is quoted in Song of Solomon. Same thing with Isaiah 35, same thing with Hosea 14. These are quoted in Song of Solomon. And think about this, that Israel's relationship with God is characterized as a marriage. And in Revelation 21 and 22, Christ the King comes back with his bride in the garden temple. I mean, all of this stuff, I just can't believe that we just think this is the Kama Sutra. You also get, and then finally you get this garden language. Again, I'd encourage you to look up these references. They may be more clear in the Hebrew, but if you have questions about them, please let me know. One of the clearest examples is Songs 4:11. It uses honey and milk together. The other 21 times those two words occur together are all references to the Promised Land. I mean, this book is just filled with hopeful language about what Israel's hoping for. It's not just a description of love as it should be, but a description of love, how love will be in the new Garden of Eden between the Messianic king and his bride, the new Adam and his bride. I mean, this book is looking for the king and his bride in the garden. And so Songs culminates this first half of the writings. This is the climax of the first half of the writings. This is what Israel is looking for. A king in his bride in the garden. That's what the whole Bible's looking for. That's what the whole Old Testament is looking for. Uh, Unfortunately, our hopes are going to come crashing down in next week in the second half of the writings. But in any case, this is the hope that we have for Israel. If you have questions, as always, please let me know.